So here we are. This is the second video we've done in this series on the extra curriculum of the Gen to Rev course. So looking forward to doing this course with you, Jess, and just getting to have an understanding of how your mind works and the way that you process and some of the most difficult parts of the Bible. And today we're going to be tackling one of those very difficult parts of the Bible. We're looking at the prophets, and there are a lot of them. It would take more than 7 days just to do the prophets if we were going to go one by one. But there's such a theme that flows through here, and part of our desire is to not skim over things because they're hard. Mm-hmm. Our desire is to speak about them, even though if we don't have all the answers, and you guys listening might have all the more questions, and it's kind of the point. And for Jess and I, that's what we kind of want to do. We want to open up this even Pandora's box of questions around this, because we believe that wisdom flows from the community. Wisdom flows through the Spirit of God, through the community. And as we ask the questions, we will get it to the heart of very much of what God has been revealing through his prophets through all of these years. I guess we should start too, like every question that we have usually originates from somewhere in our own spirit and in our own story. And so often when I'm reading the Bible, Jess, I'm going, how do I fit my story into that? And with the prophets, I like fitting my story into the verses of restoration, of hope, of reconciliation, of God being victorious and all that sort of stuff. But I do not like trying to fit my story into places where God seems as though he's had enough. And there's a lot of challenging things that happen inside of these verses. How was that for an introduction, Jess? We good?
That was really insightful, actually. I'm glad you went there, because that gives me a portrait of why I get really stuck on the challenging pieces. I'm more drawn to the fall, the crisis, the terror aspects of the scripture that I sit in, and I kind of let all the good stuff. I can understand that, but I'm really drawn to the really, really heavy, hard stuff, because I think I just have a heart for understanding why it's there. So that's kind of the sticky stuff. Actually, I thought we could call this the prickly prophet conversation, the bonus conversation for our course, because there are so many great elements to the prophecies that we get to read through. I think there's 17 books in this session that we're going to do on day 5. But there's a lot of areas in there that I get stuck on. And Matt's been very gracious in listening to me kind of process some of these harder chapters, but I don't want to skip over them. I want to give them a little bit of room, but I don't want to focus on just the hard chunks of this, because there's so much goodness there. So that's kind of where I'm coming from today. And I'm hoping we can get into some of that really hard stuff. What do you think?
I think so. I think so. And well, it's part of why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
Is we're opening up the Bible and letting it breathe for our own lives. And see, when I think of the prophets, I'm often drawn to the verses that I want to hear. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. Like Isaiah 41, verse 9 and 10 have been some of my go-to verses since I was a teenager. I remember the first Bible that I actually cared for when I was a teenager. I had this black imitation leather New King James.
Oh, good.
And I remember underlining it. It was the very first verses in any Bible that I actually underlined. And all of these years later, and so 40 years later, I'm still remembering those verses. And I remember those verses particularly because they have a context.
Mm-hmm.
at the age of 14, you don't know the context of Israel. You can go, okay, they were doing really hard stuff or bad stuff, but at 14, I knew what fear was. I knew what anxiety was. And for some reason or other, those verses opened up inside of my spirit. And so, yeah, they are encouraging, but they're spoken into difficult times and seasons. Do you have verses from the prophets that you often go back to like that?
Yeah, but I have such a different story with the beginning in my approach to reading the prophecies and the Bible. They were so confusing to me because I didn't even read them until I was in my 30s. And we'd been in the church for quite a while, but man, these really weren't the scriptures of the week that were being preached on or any context given in any way. So mostly I just heard some of the really popular phrases, but I think the most one of the most significant scriptures from the prophets was Isaiah 53.
Okay.
And I was so confused because I read it and I literally didn't understand why they were talking about Jesus in the Old Testament. It was talking about the suffering servant, and I just knew that it was Christ. And I actually had to look up and see when that book was originated and who wrote it and what this. I had never heard of a messianic prophecy before, so it just really blew my mind. So that was always one that I just really drew me into. Who are the prophets? What are they about?
Yep. Explain to people what a messianic prophecy is, Jess.
Oh, well, we're going to really unpack that in session 5. But for today, there's just so many nods in the Old Testament to this fulfillment of this Messiah that the Israelites were waiting for, and that was going to redeem their people, God's chosen people, and restore. He was going to a king. Do you know the actual meaning of the word Messiah? Is it anointed?
Mm-hmm. That's my understanding. Yeah.
I think so. So is this. But they were looking for a king and a ruler, someone that was really powerful that was going to help them take back their promised land. Right? Is that good?
That's my take on it as well.
Like that, you're going to get whatever comes out of my mouth. But yeah.
That's cool. So let's jump into this prickly prophet. Can we start with the most prickliest?
Ooh,
can we do that? What's the things in Jesse DeCourcy's world that have messed her up a little with this concept of prophecy?
Let's dive in. I like this. Yeah, so I guess I was really looking to read the story about who God was in the Old Testament. So when I came to the prophets, there was so much anger and rage where it feels like next level wrath from God, where he's really descriptive about what he's going to do to his people and make them pay and not forgive them of their sins. So this completely defied what I knew of the gospel, of who Jesus was and what he came to do. And I could not reconcile how God could sound that way. But also I was supposed to see him, or Christ, embody the Father. I literally could not reconcile it, and I still struggle on many of these passages. So this morning I've been spending a lot of time in Amos, which, to no surprise, there were a lot of really harsh moments in there. I could read it, but there's mention of dead bodies being thrown about and just decimating the people because of their sin. So when I think of God as patient, slow to anger, that I'm not judged and there's no condemnation, this seems quite the opposite. So without any context of the history of the people and why this was so problematic to God, I really struggled, to say the very least.
Yes. So, and I think you've really pulled on the right thread right there, Jess, because again, with our context, we judge by what we see. And I think that's something we do in our culture a lot. We will see an outcome and we'll create a story around that outcome long before we actually sit with the person to discover why they did what they did. And I think in Bible times, And this is not diminishing how harsh some of these verses are, because like Jess has said, they are brutal. Like God, it seems like he's at the end of his rope. He's done. He's absolutely done. It's like Hosea. He's like, I'm going to divorce you. This is no longer a thing. And he cuts the tie between Israel and himself, which is one of the most shocking things for Israel to hear in the Old Testament. In Amos, he doesn't use the analogy of divorce. He uses the concept of death and the removal of presence, which I think just taps back into Cain, where Cain's fearing that place of losing the presence of God. And I think in Amos, he's giving us a window, an understanding of this is what it looks like to be removed from God's presence. And Amos, there's a lot of reasons I enjoy Amos, and having just recently read through it all again, I love the way it starts. I'm a shepherd. Yes. What am I doing here? And later on, he says, I'm not trained as a prophet. And you and I were just having a chat before, and I think that's nearly humorous. I think God would just be laughing when he said, I wasn't trained as a prophet. And the concept in scripture is like David was not trained as a king. Mm-hmm. He was set apart as a king. And I think Amos, God's like, yeah, you're a shepherd, bro. I fully get that. You look after sheep and trees, apparently, sycamore trees. Yeah. But on top of that, you're my mouthpiece. And whether you want to own the phrase or not. But Amos is like that. And if you read it, the beautiful thing I find about Amos is he had a relationship with God, such a relationship that he wasn't just passing on messages from God to people. He was actually interceding at one point for God's people, because God's like, right, I'm done, I'm finished. And it's like a Moses-esque moment where he says the same thing, and Moses goes into bat for the people, and God relents. Yeah. He does the most untheological thing of all time. He changes his mind.
And there you just hit another nerve. How can God change his mind like that in the midst of his anger? But he does. And his mercy always comes through. I think that's the ebb and flow of the prophets, but I think there is a lot of questions that I have also when it seems like the punishment sometimes doesn't meet the crime, or there's some injustice there. Like I shared with you a couple weeks ago, or was it a couple weeks ago now, with Ezekiel? You were telling me of a few powerful places in Ezekiel that you really like. So I opened it thinking, I just need to get in some of this goodness that Matt sees in Ezekiel. And there's this really hard part where God talks about taking his most treasured possession, which is his wife. And he's not even permitted to weep or mourn her loss. And she passes away, and he uses it to speak to the people. So when I'm looking for the character of God in that and his goodness, these are the questions that I have. And I really find it hard for anybody to have these conversations with me on how to approach this and what I should do with it. So I assume there's other people out there like me that aren't just happy skimming over it because it lingers.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt the same when I read through Hosea, and God tells him to name his kids after abominations.
Yeah.
And years ago, I was preaching through Hosea, and I couldn't find the love of God in that. I can understand the message of God in that, but it's not just Hosea that's saying these things, it's the kids that inherit those things.
Yeah.
And I really struggle with it. And to this day, like I've got a growing list of questions that I do want to ask Jesus when I do sit down with him. And people at times think that's humorous, but for me, I just don't get it. Like, you can explain it, and I've heard theologians, I've heard commentaries explain it away, but me being me, these are real lives. These aren't just robots that have been named something ridiculous and they represent something, or a rock that gets named something and okay, it's just a rock. But these are people. And this is where part of this, the questions are left unanswered for me. And each
Mhm.
time I read through Hosea, I find myself going, I must have missed something here in the narrative. I have to go back and reread it, but I don't want to reread it because of the narrative that's flowing through it.
Yes. So if we know God is love and we know the meta narrative of this story of God is love, that's the wrestle, because I want to be able to find it there and I can't. But I think that's where I've been sitting with this place. I've been reading this book called The Prophets
Mm.
by Abraham Heschel. And it's really given me new perspective that I don't think I've ever had when I approach these readings, because I've always taken this wrath, this anger, this disconnect I see in God in some of these harder passages. And I look at that as an absence of God, of his character, of who he is, of a loving God. But as he's describing it, that's a really hard place, because the fact that this wrath is there and this judgment is his passion, that just is evidence of how much he hates evil. And you wouldn't have judgment if you didn't have love. So it's kind of helping me pull back the layers. I can understand the wrath a little bit more, because I know this wrath is against the very thing that's keeping his people from him. And he hates that, and he'd do anything to get rid of that separation. And I understand that, but there's, yeah, some of those harder places where it seems that this is just a little different, like you shared, and
Yeah.
naming the names of the children that just are a little harder to chew on for me. So how can we pull back a little bit even there?
I think even as you're talking, it reminds me of Jesus in the temple whipping the vendors out of the temple. Like if that happened today, you'd be calling the police, and Jesus would be spending some time in jail. And I guess that's what they wanted back then too. But the concept for me when I studied that part of Scripture was that they were selling where the Gentiles would come to worship, and so the sellers were preventing Gentiles from coming into that place of the temple where they could worship. It's my understanding of it. And so Jesus' expression of driving the vendors out so people could come for what? For worship. And again, I think the metaphor is not lost on me, that when we prevent people from discovering the Father heart, coming close to the Holy of Holies, his anger, his frustration, his wrath, that's where those moments are of us. When Jesus said, don't stop the little children from coming to me, you for me, there's little threads of it inside of that. We have to be open to that space where Jesus wants us in that deep place of relationship. And so to me, Jess, that's the Eden moment breaking open for us in all of this. And so the little children could come and sit on his lap and a blessing would be given. Nothing separates Jesus from those children from the Father's love. And there's a joy in that moment. I've often used that when I'm dedicating children, just to say, yeah, this is the true Father heart, that where nothing separates us from his love. So there's no wrath in that moment whatsoever. And so I think you see it on the cross as well, where the criminal beside him says, well, today, I'll remember you and you'll be with me in paradise. You have these moments of even great trial and suffering, and Jesus is still, it's not his wrath that is flowing over the man beside, rather it's his grace even inside of that. And so for me, it's that draw near to God moment in James, and I will draw near to you. And so wrath dissipates when connection and relationship are empowered. The narrative changes utterly and completely in the Bible every single time that actually happens. And like in Israel's kings, every king starts off and he was good in the eyes of the Lord, or he was evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so you have this essence that when the king was good in the eyes of the Lord, the community came into that place of blessing with the Lord as well. And so you have this, and like you said, an ebb and flow inside of the Bible all the time that was governed from this place of, in my take, in relationship with God. And so he was more than happy for people to entertain that space with him, Holy of Holies and all. But if they wanted to go and entertain that with other things and often in Israel's history, you hear those other things have been connected to other nations, and then they would take the practices of other nations, and like Amos then sort of shifts into that place about moral failure of a nation that has got to the point of utter depravity, and God's just going, actually, I can't do this anymore. How do you feel about all that?
Yeah, it just reminds me how important context is again.
Yeah.
Because we can't even fathom what it was like. But Amos gives us a really good image of the wickedness that's happening, the oppression, the way that people are taking advantage of the poor and the innocent. And I was reading something today that said, if you ask the prophets if God was being irrational or unjust or a little too much, they would not have said so. And we're trying to put ourselves in their shoes, and it's impossible. But we were speaking a little bit as I was reading, so many of the evils that are going on aren't that much different than what we have going on in our world today. So I can at least understand some of the weight, not personally, because I'm blessed and in a safe community, in a safe country where I live, that I don't have the same fear every day that I think these people were seeing face to face in my nice little bubble that I have around me. But I can appreciate that element that this is coming from a loving place from God, and not a place where his desire for this is for me to be afraid of him.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was thinking a little bit, I would love to talk and bring it back to some of the foundation that you laid down in Eden's blueprint, where you spoke about how fear really separates us from love and presence. And we weren't really designed for that to be our entry point with a relationship with God, which unfortunately, a lot of these theologies that are built around some of these portraits of God, if I can say it that way,
Yeah.
lead us astray into thinking that fear of God is a really good thing. But I think there's a few different kinds of fearing God that maybe we could talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting phrase for me, the fear of the Lord, because it's used, well, from the way I understand it, over a dozen different ways inside of the Bible. Last time I checked, there were 15 different words for fear in the Bible. And that alone for me, in my curiosity, goes, I need to work out what those 15 are. Because when people start throwing around that phrase, the fear of the Lord, I want to know what it means. I don't want to just use it because that's what Christians do. I want to know why that phrase was used. See, when I was in Lebanon, and this is where a lot of Eden's blueprint came out of, there are a number of experiences I had that I had no grid for. Growing up like you in a safe country where I've never known, like in my lifetime, there's been no war per se that Australia has been conscripted for and all that sort of stuff. And so when I went to Lebanon and I started listening to stories, I can understand one person's story gets exaggerated and you just go, wow, okay, was that true? Is that? But when I started hearing many and repeated, my heart broke. My heart broke in ways because I felt utterly helpless. The need was so great that, and to this day, it is still so great that it brings me to tears every time I put myself back in Lebanon. And when I read through Amos of the things that the people were doing, these were the stories I was hearing coming out of Syria. And as a father, as a man, as a husband, every part of my spirit was enraged by the experiences I was listening to. How do we get there? How did the world get to that place where this violence has been a thing? And I know that's a far bigger conversation than what we're having here, but when I started seeing the power of love at work, like there's one time, Jess, we were in a sewing room where they were teaching Syrian women how to sew, because Syrian women are not allowed, many of the women are not allowed to be educated And it was a thing that the men just, like, you would offend them if their wives were educated or they worked. Well, many of these women, they didn't know where their husbands were. So in this one sewing room, there was 15 women. And the interpreter said, would any of you like to share your story to these women? 15 women put their hands up. Now, in Australia, we wouldn't have done that. Like, it would be, I don't want to put my story out there, that's too vulnerable. But here's 15 women. We did not have the time to listen to their stories because one story would go for many minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And all they're telling you is the last few months of their life. It's not what they've grown up with. And inside of that room, I was listening to things so horrific that it was making me weep. But I was watching joy so tremendous that my brain could not connect these two things together.
Yeah.
And at the end of the time with these women, the interpreter said, would two of your women, like from our community, would they pray? And it was very appropriate for women to do the praying that particular moment, and two women did. And they came to the table, and both of them just fell to their knees, couldn't pray. They were just crying. What I watched was 15 Syrian women gather around and lift them up, hug them, love on them. Where's fear in that room? I don't know. I don't know what these women go back to at a night. I heard some of the stories of what they go back to in the night, and the insecurity and the lack. But what I was watching was this extraordinary concept of the love of God, the honor, the awe, the power of God happen in a way that there was no preaching, there was just presence. There was story, there was testimony, but somehow or other there was joy. And so when I think of the fear of the Lord in those kinds of moments, I don't wrap around the concept that I'm scared of him, or I've got real anxiety because he's here in the room, or I need to go and even hide my face away from him because he's so magnificent. I found myself wanting just to be present in that moment, to let my Western conservative raised Baptist boy brain let itself explode so that you could actually find more room for what this thing called the fear of the Lord actually is. And it changed my life. Moments like those, I don't think I wrote that one in my book, that experience, but that moments like those, I came back from there just going, my gosh, we're just chipping at the surface of this thing called the love of God or the fear of the Lord. We have our theories, we have our theologies, but we don't have our understandings. So yeah, so I know that's a long story, Jess, but
No, you just contextualized this hard stuff for me, because I can take that experience and put it right on top. I think it's so much easier to pay attention to the fear aspects that I'm reading than it is to look at the mercy and the grace and the love that God is continually coming back to his people with. And he just never gives up on them over and over. And we even see that in Amos, like you said, where he actually is relenting. It just took one righteous prayer, one moment. I can just picture Amos in the room praying, and God's presence just right there, just the two of them, and poof, his anger or that wrath or whatever we want to call it in that moment just makes way to mercy and grace and compassion. And that's the part that I want to focus on in session 5 when we go there a little bit more. But I think we have to look at all these different attributes that we see so we can get what you just did, bring it back, make it personal for us so we can understand it better.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons why I want to take people to Lebanon. I've been talking about it for too long. It's like writing a book. COVID did mess up everything in the midst of wanting to go back into Lebanon, but I want people, particularly, I don't know, this is why I found it so powerful for myself. I'd never experienced anything like that. I could never comprehend that until I actually sat on the ground. And there was one time just late in the trip where I just sat on the ground in the dirt on the hills of Beirut by myself, and I must have looked a little bit foolish, but I just let my fingers dig into the ground. Part of me, there's a history geek part of me that loves feeling like buildings and soil and things like that. But I found myself just sitting there on the ground with my fingers in the dirt, and I've got this red dirt over there as well that you just sort of put your fingers into. And I wanted to connect with the ground. I wanted to connect with the life that has flowed through that ground and the life that has been poured into that ground. Because Lebanon is a country where people have fought over it for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
And so lives have been lost there. And so for me, it was a very precious moment of recalibration. And again, when I was reading through Amos, getting ready for this, I found myself just sitting back there on the ground, fingers in the soil, and feeling the presence of God all around me.
Mm. And now we all get to experience that with you. Thank you for sharing that. That's so good. We get to share a little teaser from your new book that's coming out.
Yeah.
We'll see it on the cover once the cover comes. But for any of you guys that know Matt and were able to read along with Eden's Blueprint, he just came out with his first book in, what was it, October of this last year.
Yep.
Now he's moving on to book number 2 that is coming within the month here. And it is going to be carrying on this powerful analogy that he started with. And maybe you should say it. You'll say it a little more eloquent than me, but of Eagle's story.
Yeah.
And it ties into what Matt just shared about Lebanon too.
Yeah. It's still a thing of wonder for me, Jess. Up until July last year, I had never in my wildest dreams thought I would write a fiction book. Even then, I was wanting Trish to do it, not me, because I reckon, and just between you and I, Jess, I thought she was going to, because she thinks this way. She's so brilliant. I thought, wow, people want to buy the book just because Trish wrote this stuff. And that was the insecure part of me saying, well, maybe she can make it good. And so we did and about it for an afternoon, and she still teases me a little bit because I just went and did it. And she goes, you didn't even give me a chance to do it. So I did it, and it turns out people enjoyed it. And so what I've done with the next story, it's called Three Trees. The cover, which everyone will see very, very soon, Jess, you've painted this beautiful picture of the eagle with his talons into the ground. And the story talks about the life that flows through everything. That John 1 concept where everything exists in and through me. It's Jesus himself. And so I'm just using some of my own experiences of feeling the ground, discovering God, meeting God in these places. And so this next book takes the narrative from the exit from Eden all the way through to Cain's life. And initially I was going to try and write a whole thing on the Old Testament where the eagle was going to skip through stories very quickly. But within 2 weeks, I discovered I had one whole book on this one part of the narrative. And for those who read it, you'll discover I've got questions in that narrative that I want answered to. My heart broke for Cain. I know he did the wrong thing. Hey, but who hasn't? Mm-hmm. And so often in our understanding of Cain's story, which doesn't get a lot of airplay. Why? Because he was the one who did the wrong thing. So where's the grace of God in that? So we look for where the grace of God is rather than where the hard stuff is, which is what we're doing in this course as well. And I look for the love of God. And so, yeah, so it's a whole story just on that. I'm looking forward to sharing it with people and hearing it. You will listen to a story of a narrative of the Bible, but you'll find my story in it. You'll find Eden's blueprint all the way through it, because I want to show people that the things I've written are the real things of my life, and the way that I've learned and the way I've listened and the way I've grown. and so that they are tangible aspects of my life. They're not just biblical concepts, which I think for the longest time, Jess, I think it's too easy for me to get lost in the biblical concepts and going, this is the right way to live.
Yeah.
I want to be a guy who lives out those concepts. And so they're tested, they're tried, they're true. And then I'm putting a fiction conversation around the story of Adam and Eve, Abel and Cain, because the story's over and done with in a couple of chapters of the whole Bible. Well, I've stretched it to about 30 chapters, and we'll see how we go.
It's so good. I can't wait for people to get their hands on it. And that's really the heart of why we're doing this course. A lot of this is coming out of the questions that have come up through reading your book and the way that you're tackling some of these harder things there. And we're just going to keep following those threads of love. And it's really easy to hide behind theology and get really buried in understanding who God is based on scripture and story, and taking the relationship out of it. So I think it's been really refreshing to be able to come alongside this journey with you and look at all of these stories through a relational lens. But that's also kind of pioneering in its own right, because it's hard to do. And I don't think a lot of people have stepped forward. Maybe they have in the past and that didn't go so well for them, but we don't need to go into the heretical conversations today, but yeah. So thanks for sharing that.
It's a joy for me. It's one of the reasons why, like, even with Greater Things, we've created a new course around creativity, because I've found for myself just a new way of connecting with the Father.
Yeah.
And my writing is like a prayer. It is a prayer. It's a communication, it's a conversation with him. And years ago, I would not have called it a prayer. It's writing, but now I know. I think I've just opened my mind to the ways that the Father communicates. So looking, and people will see all the artwork that you put into this book too. And I was talking with a guy who's pre-reading it for me to put an endorsement in it. He's a good friend of mine, Carl Smith, from the UK. And he said to me last night, he goes, these pictures are telling me a story. They are beautiful. And that's what and like when we sat down together to say, hey, this is what I'm thinking, I'd never done this before. I'd never spoken to an artist to say, hey, here's my best go at being really awkward and uncomfortable and in how to talk artistic. How do we go? And you put up with my ignorance, and and you produce something magnificent. Although
Yes.
we should say Winnie wasn't happy, was she, with your
No.
eagle?
Yeah, I was, and if you don't know, Matt and Trish are in Sydney, Australia. They have different eagles there. So I had to clarify first, what does your eagle look like in your story? So I started painting that eagle. My daughter was not happy. She's 6 years old. She painted her own bald eagle version of the wedge-tailed eagle.
Yep.
Right? Hysterical. But Matt has included that in his book as well. So just gracious, so thankful.
Yeah. Well, I'm thrilled to share it. It's just everything about Winnie being in this book is about what Trish and I are about as well. It's there's no sacred cows. It's just this, or golden calves or whatever we put out there. It's just when we hear the children talk, we want to listen to what God's saying. And so, yeah.
The young prophets of our time. Do we have time to talk about one more little nugget? So for the longest time, I think that I was approaching the prophets and forgetting that they were people. I was really just looking for them to inform me who God is through their words as mouthpiece of God. But you and I have talked a little bit more about just from a very personal perspective of the prophets and what they were going through, and tying that a little bit into some of those fundamentals that you teach of prophecy, or how we each hear and speak on behalf of God. Could we just touch a little bit on that today? What happens if we forget that the prophets are actually people?
Well, I think it's kind of touching on Amos, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
Dude, I didn't ask for this. Is effectively what he said in Australian language. We would say fair dinkum. Serious, God? Like, there are other phrases, but I won't speak them out loud on a recording.
No.
But this is part of the essence for me. Like, when we see prophets in scripture, we can put them up on pedestals.
Mhm.
But if we do so, we lose their story. Elisha was a farmer when Elijah just turns up and throws his robe over him and walks off.
So weird.
It would be very weird, but to Elisha, it's like, I'm done.
All right.
It's time to barbecue the cows, and away we go. Best barbecue they had for ages, probably. But every person's story has a concept of where they've connected with God. And so for Winnie, she connects with God through art, through creativity. I think she connects with God through joy too. She's cheeky as that little one. And I love it. It's just beautiful. But when you listen to the story, like even with the story of Winnie, you can't listen to the story of Winnie without listening to the story of Jesse and Trev, because you guys have opened that door. You've given her that safe place to be there, to be who she is. There's others in our community that have done exactly the same thing. And a community then embraces the young prophet from her story further forward. And so where Winnie is in 20 years' time, we have no idea, but we know where she started from. And I think where we look at the prophets in the Bible, often we pick up their narrative right where they are at, and that's it. We don't know a lot more past what did Amos do? Did he go back and still look after sycamore trees? I don't know. But we know nothing other than, I guess, he was generationally a shepherd. So the story for me is so important, and listening to the story. So when people prophesy today, they prophesy through a lens of what they've experienced God doing. And I think the prophets of the day there, they weren't outside of Israel. They were inside of Israel. They were part of it. So their prophetic words weren't, you guys suck and I'm doing this thing great. Their words were, I'm a part of Israel. These words are for Israel. And I'm going to walk that journey out with Israel. Like Nehemiah, Ezra, two powerful prophetic voices inside of it that demonstrated it by their story. At great cost to themselves, they demonstrated it. And I think this is, for me, the essence behind the prophetic today. We can look at someone and call them a prophet, but I want to look at their story and discover their name. I want to discover who they are.
Yeah. So why is the plight of the prophet so lonely?
In the Bible or today?
Yeah, both. Probably both.
I think sometimes for us today is because we think, sometimes it's self-fulfilling, my friend. And I've found many Christians who have this martyrdom thing that's happening for them. How about we talk ourselves into blessings rather than out of them? How about we look for community? Like Saul, before he became king, like he found a traveling band of prophets. What was going on with that? Whatever was going on with it was, when people saw Saul, they thought, this can't be the same guy, because of the transformation that was actually happening. And so it's not about lonely, because I think loneliness is actually the first, well, as in Eden's blueprint, it's the first problem in Eden.
Yeah.
God recognized that Adam needed relationship. And so I think for me, and it's part of what we're doing with Greater Things, is breaking down some of those long-held theologies about how the prophetic supposedly works in our society. And I know I might be pushing dangerously close to some people's belief systems in that, but I think we're all in that place of hearing the voice of God. And if we can hear him, we should be able to speak him. And I think this is a time where we are releasing voices rather than shutting them down. And so what people are finding in the Greater Things community are the like-minded people who square peg round hole. They've been trying to be this person in an environment where it does feel very lonely because there's no one around them talking the same language. Well, I think these days are changing. And so definitely in the Old Testament, there were times with great isolation. Jeremiah was one of them. He's known as the weeping prophet. And I've even heard a lecturer call him the depressed prophet. And when you read his story, you go, every reason to believe that, right? You get stuck down a well or a cistern for that long, you're going to be pretty upset by the time you come out of it, right? And so I understand that. I get that. And I think at times there was a cultural thought that that's how you had to be. And I know at times when you see some of history that Israel would have their prophets out there in the wilderness, just doing weird things. Isaiah was one of them. You know, anytime God tells you to get around naked for 2 years, I would want to do that alone too.
And these are some of the other prickly places of the prophet stories.
Is that too much to drop in on this conversation today? I don't know.
I could do this all day. Yeah. No, that's fair. And the message they were often sharing was not one that anyone wanted to hear or receive. So there's so much rejection in their stories as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if we want to finish it here, so much of the prophets in the Old Testament, they talk about the remnant. Yeah. And these are the square peg round hole people in my take. These are the ones who are like, yeah, I get what you're saying about God, but that's not my take on him. I've actually got a relationship with him. They are the Jobs of this world that have gone, okay, a lot of really challenging stuff has happened, but something that I'm connecting with is my relationship with the Father, and nothing's going to steal that away. I think that the Old Testament is laced with those kinds of people. And a lot of them are unknown. Amos was very happy to be an unknown part of the remnant. But he wasn't. But I think that these days is where we're actually seeing these people who are just sold out for the concept of relationship with God as being the thing. That's how he has always operated. And I just see that communities of people now are gathering around that concept rather than a religion or religious one.
Yeah. Amen. It's probably a good place to break. So hopefully we've encouraged the ability to hold some tension, maybe.
Yeah.
Prophets today.
Yep. And I think just to know, it wouldn't matter who you had sitting in front of you to do this talk. Our knowledge stops somewhere. Our experiences stop somewhere. And this is why community for us is so important, is when we are in community, we can explore some of those experiences as well in a safe place. So yeah. Is that good?
That's great.
That's a good place. Okay. Yeah. Well, we're less than 2 weeks away of starting this course. We are so looking forward to going 7 days straight. But yeah, so keep your comments coming. Any questions that are happening, we will start up the Facebook group. We should probably start that up this week, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
Have we already started it?
We have it. It's there. We just have to guide people to it that want to participate in it. So maybe we'll put the word out today and start getting some questions rolling and conversations in there.
Sounds good. Okay, everyone. We're looking forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks on a daily basis. Thanks, Jess, for all that you're doing. Can't wait to unpack more of this with you.
Yeah, thanks for going to the hard places today.
Cool. Bye for now.